So I guess we're live here. Here we are, everybody. Yeah,
Uh,
we need to we need to take these letters very seriously. And
yeah,
I've been calling for this idea of a letter to America from congressional Dems to
right.
lay out the injuries, abuses, and usurpations, as they called it in the Declaration of Independence, of Trump. And that, hopefully this is going to inspire many others to reach to a higher rhetorical level and in our as we try to mount an effective opposition to Trump, you know.
Well, as soon as Rick Wilson joins, he and I, having gone to Harvard, can talk more about this.
I'm trying, guys. My camera doesn't want to flip around
That,
right now, which is kind
that's
of
all right. Well,
exciting.
Well,
we can see your,
it's very pretty, Rick.
we can see your
Thank you.
backyard. It looks very nice.
How about this? I'll just turn the
Wait,
camera around this way.
there's the Posse Comitatus flag. What channel? Here we are, the Armory. We're getting close now.
Yes.
We could probably have the greatest live stream ever if we just did like a tour of Rick's house. Like, and for special founder subscribers, they can go. They can go into the hidden garage and they can go in the bunker,
the
the
There are
bunker,
secret
underground bunker
rooms.
of Rick
the
Wilson.
bunker is only for very big donors, I think.
Very big
Yes, that's
donors go in the
correct.
bunker. And there's even a more elite list that would be allowed in when the apocalypse comes. Um, so we were just talking about this great piece that Simon wrote. This, I mean, we're in this extraordinary crisis in education. I mean, it really. I was thinking about it. When I was growing up, the crisis in education was immigration, and
Sure.
you had then at least confidence in a president who, if necessary, would send the National Guard to Little Rock High School, uh, or another president who would send the National Guard to the University of Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
which arguably was the last battle of the Civil War. They had 30,000 troops in Oxford, Mississippi, a town of about 8,000, um,
Right.
to integrate one African American into Ole Miss. Today, the only reason you'd have a riot at Ole Miss over an African American is if some African American athlete committed and he decommitted and decided to go to Alabama. There would be, why isn't he coming here? We're rioting, which I actually find kind of hopeful. But this seems to me to be a dark. Well, I don't know. It's hard to compare darknesses, but um, at the very top, you have evil intent, as opposed to
Yeah.
states that were increasingly out of the mainstream. Um, the
What interests me
letter,
about this academic
yeah,
fight, guys, and I want to get your opinion, both of you, on it. What interests me about this academic fight is a few universities have sort of caved, but I think for the first time, Harvard realized it has a $90 billion endowment.
yeah. I mean, Harvard,
And
Harvard is a hedge fund that has classes.
yes,
I mean,
what I'm thinking is that it's like all these other universities have buckled down or buckled under, and Harvard basically said yesterday, in polite Cambridge terms, go fuck yourself.
yep.
And I think it speaks well to the fact that they acknowledge they've already started doing some reforms in the way they manage students, manage protests, those sort of things, but they're not bending the knee. And unlike a lot of American institutions, from Apple down to CBS News to everybody else who are paying the vig or bending the knee, they said no. And a couple of law firms, could take a lesson from that, um, and say no once in a while. Autocrats don't like to be told no, but it's good when they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only way this is going to happen, right? I mean, the only way that we are going to get to the other
Yeah.
side of this and defeat Trump and this sort of fascistic moment is by, courageous acts by individual peoples and institutions who refuse to bend the knee, to use your term, Rick, and who, because courage can become contagious, is the line that we're all using now. And I do think the reason I focused on this in my newsletter this morning was that it wasn't just the courage of the act, the defiance, it was the power of the rationale and the reasoning, and how concise and clear and muscular and inspirational the language was that Harvard
Yes.
president used. In a time when, I have been calling, I have two reflections on this morning. One is because of the gravity of the moment. Timothy Snyder, another Substacker,
Sure.
we're all Substackers now, right?
The
Has
Canadian.
Yeah, the Canadian has one of his most powerful essays today, and it's a brief on what he calls state terror, and he
Mhm.
explains how what happened yesterday in the Oval Office was a confirmation of that Trump is now going to be using state terror against Americans and against people who are legally resident here, and eventually, against Americans themselves, of citizens. And I encourage everyone to read it. It informed my understanding today. And my big takeaway from all this is that, we previous generations of Americans fought state terror, Nazi state terror, Soviet state terror, and Trump and Stephen Miller are emulating it. And
Yeah.
it is what is so remarkable about this, is if they've been students of history in the way that we've all been students of history to learn what not to do, and that they studied the Nazis and the Soviets to emulate and
Right.
copy what they've done, because the speed in which all this is happening only could have come about through extraordinary preparation and coaching. I still think we're going to find out one day that these long phone calls that Vladimir Putin and Trump have had over the last few years was Putin coaching Trump how to do all this, because I think Trump at his base is
100%.
is an idiot, and I don't think he learns things very quickly, but he's learned how to be a fascist dictator really quickly. I mean, and has moved through the learning
Top of the
stages,
class.
top of the class, right? And something that he's not used to being. And so I just throw this out there that we are in this moment where if there is any sort of like way of normalizing or looking away or pretending this isn't happening any longer, the 5 alarm fire, whatever the hell you want to call it, we're here now, right? They're
Right.
disappearing. The young Tufts student who disappeared. I went to Tufts. I know where that corner. I had friends who lived on that block when I was at Tufts. They're disappearing students into unmarked vans, right? Without any due process. And so we're here now. And the question really becomes, as you guys know, every day, is what are we going to do about it, right? And that's why I think what the Harvard University did and President Garber did was so important, because it was an act of incredibly powerful defiance.
Sure.
And because what happens is, right, there is a limit to what that they can do to, they don't give them the $2 billion. Harvard can replenish that with their endowment. I mean, they have limited capacity to really rain terror down on Harvard the way they want. And I think
Right.
all of us are going to have to learn that we all have to, in our own way, be Harvard University every day and stand up, take concrete actions of defiance, do it in a way that's powerful and articulate, right? We have to tap into this great, powerful set of emotions around patriotism and love of country and the greatness of America that's going to animate and inspire us through all this. And I hope that this does inspire other universities, other institutions to realize that they have no choice other than to defy, and that bending the knee is no longer an option.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do think, and I wrote a piece for a subscriber piece today for Lincoln Square, and I,
Which
you
is a
know,
great, great piece. And if for no other reason, you should subscribe to Lincoln Square to read Rick's piece.
well,
No,
but it
seriously,
it
it's a tremendous piece.
thank you, Stuart. Thank you. I appreciate that. It basically, though, argues that if you think it stops with students or you think it stops with legal immigrants, when Trump yesterday, there was a slip of the tongue when he said the homegrowns. And first he said the homegrowns, the homegrowns. And then he tweets out, or excuse me, truths out on his social media platform, um, jokingly, haha, nudge, nudge, owning the libs about sending Tesla protesters to El Salvador. if you think that this is where it stops, everybody, I have terrible news for you. If you think it stops with illegals, you're wrong. If you think it stops with legal immigrants that you don't like, you're wrong. If you think it stops with students who have opinions you don't like but are here legally on a visa, you're wrong. It will eventually creep to the point where Maggie Haberman is in the back of a fucking unmarked van because she pissed him off one day. It'll eventually reach the point where, as he said, he wants Bukele, the El Salvadorian dictator, who proudly calls himself a dictator, to build 5 more CCOTs, 5 more of these super prisons. That's not America. That's something very different. That's a gulag, folks. That's Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev. That is not an American system of government.
Yeah, you know, Rick, I think so. One of the problems that we have in this moment, this long moment, as it's turning out to be, is we tend to assume that there will be a point at which they will reach in which will be too much.
Right.
And there isn't that point. We have to understand these people are a threat to what we consider to be what it means to be an American. They want an entirely different definition of it. Um, and, you know, so, I mean, you're a student of the Democratic Party. What do you think they should do? Should they be chartering, you know, big planes and elected officials flying down to El Salvador?
Well,
Or
I
did
think,
that just make it and then look weak because he still will say no? Or
well,
what
let's
do you think
see.
they ought to be
I
doing?
mean, I think that the point that we're all getting at in our own ways here is that the time for sort of us believing that conventional methods in
Right.
responding to this are going to be sufficient is we're way past that at this point. And that's why Chris Van Hollen, Senator Van Hollen, who is a great senator from Maryland, has said he's going to fly to
Yep.
El Salvador. And he may be denied at the airport. They may jail him. They may not let him in. It doesn't matter anymore. These are things that we must do, right? We have to start having greater ambition and greater willingness to try new things that may be uncomfortable. Because I think to both of you, I have this sort of general thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is that, you know, when you saw the people in South Korea rush to overthrow their leader who sort of started moving in a dictatorial fashion,
Mm-hmm.
you saw Bolsonaro being indicted effectively in Brazil. Part of the reason why this is happening is those countries have recent experience with illiberalism and authoritarianism. And so in the body politic and in the memory of the people living in those countries and in those institutions is a recent experience with with what we're going through. We don't have that experience in the American story. We were founded to be a counter to that, to imagine a government that wasn't run, or a people that weren't governed by kings and oligarchs and multi-generational monarchs and all the things that we know from the old world. And so in our own story, we don't have like, oh, Trump is one of those guys, right? That has
Right.
an
That's my
American,
point. That we
yeah, yeah. And so I think just to finish is that I think that's why one of the things that I'm arguing is we have to tie back to the Declaration of Independence, because there is an actual American version of this story. It was the whole reason our country was founded, right? To rebel against a mad king who was taking away our liberties. And so we actually do have an American version of this story. It's the founding story. It's the story in the Declaration of the Independence and the Constitution and the whole premise of America. Because part of where I think we have to go with Trump, if I can just make this last point, is that this is the greatest betrayal of America that there has ever been. He is a betrayer. He's a traitor to, and that these guys are committing crimes. I mean, our language in describing what they're doing is insufficiently aggressive every day. And so part of what we have to do also is
yes.
we cannot start part of
So
our rebellion and part of our work to defy is to find more appropriate language, which is why these things like what Harvard just did is so important because rhetorically we are not where we need to be with the
Well, Tom,
American
and this
people
is
and
why, you
describing
know,
all this.
this is why I've advocated that Attorney General of Massachusetts should file criminal charges against those involved. This is kidnapping and human trafficking. And the fact that they are wearing a uniform does not make it legal. But the
Right.
fact that drug dealers in New York City and Serpico were wearing uniforms did not make it legal. Um, and I think you want to push this to a crisis. You want to be in front of a court arguing that I have a duty as an attorney general to protect citizens of my state, and these are crimes against citizens of my state of the grievous sort. The next step is death squads. And if we have death squads, are we going to say there's nothing that a state official can do? There's nothing that a local police
Right.
department can do, sheriffs can do. They have to reassert that. And in a way, it's sort of taking the states' rights argument that was used for integration and segregation and turning it on its head. That the states have an obligation here um, to defend its citizens.
Yeah.
And I wish they would escalate to that point
So let me, if I can just
and
make a quick point,
reframe it.
and then Rick should jump in. But I do think I interviewed Attorney General Chris Mays from Arizona last week, and
Mhm.
we at Hopium have launched a series of interviews with Democratic attorney generals because I do
Perfect.
think this point that you're making is really critical. Is that one of the breaks and the bulwarks against Trump is federalism, right? Is that,
Right.
in a way that I don't think they really understood, by the way. I think that in some interesting way, the way that states and the attorney generals, because these are people who represent a government. It's not a private citizen bringing a suit, right? An attorney general has greater stature than many
Yes.
of the other suits because they represent a government of the United States, not the federal government, but another government of the United States. And I do think, I had a long talk yesterday with the political team of the Democratic Attorney General's organization about them writing a letter to America, them becoming far more aggressive politically, not just legally. That I think these 23 Democratic attorney generals who started meeting a year before this all happened, they were prepared. We need to lift them up into greater and give them greater permission structure to do the kinds of things that you're talking, Stuart. Is that we are really at a point now where you're exactly right. I mean, this is a citizen of Massachusetts. The attorney general in the state of Massachusetts with a Democratic, governor should be aggressively now confronting the federal government over these
100%.
policies. And so I do think you're right. I mean, that we have, look, what we're all learning here, what's so important, and I'm sorry for being so animated this morning and fired up, is that I was really fired up by this Harvard thing because I do think that in the sort of comfortable elite circles in the United States, there has been this ongoing, like, it just can't be this bad, right?
Right.
And this sort of like, he can't go there. It's just too outrageous. But we're there now, and I think that you're seeing increasing numbers of important institutions and leaders start. Obama and Joe Biden are starting to get into the game, right? Like we're starting to see more people diving in here, which is what we're going to need to do, which is what we need to happen. Everyone's got to do their part now, right? That's the point. And
Normalcy bias, interestingly, has affected elite Americans in my view a lot more severely than I mean. I think a lot of folks in the MAGA world
Consistently.
right now are in complete shock over the economic devastation they're facing. I've been exchanging emails with a guy in California who is very red guy, very MAGA guy, who the first few were very ugly, and the last couple have been very civil because he's like, I didn't understand what he was going to do, but if I'd listened, I would have understood. But I think with a lot of elite Americans, there is that sort of comfortable belief of I've got money, I've got status, I've got stature. This can't happen to me. This won't happen to my law firm, my company, my bank, my family. And the rule of authoritarianism is it does happen to you. It does happen to people who don't expect it to happen, don't expect to have it happen to themselves. Um, I I I was looking around a minute ago because somebody else quoted this morning, but I just from and I want to go back to the federalism question for 1 second. Then I'll read what I had here. There was a period of time between the year 2010 and the year 2016 where Republicans were obsessed about federalism, obsessed about states' rights, obsessed about the 10th Amendment, obsessed about the fact that governors in states had the broadest conceivable latitude outside of a certain narrow band of constitutional questions. And now, in this post-conservative era, MAGA's like, no, everything must stem from the president. The executive is the single source of authority in the country. Courts have no right to constrain the executive. States have no right to constrain the executive. In a weird way, I think they've set themselves up on the Trump side to they've put themselves in the role of an authoritarian government that Americans have dealt with once before, and that was during the Revolutionary War. And I read somebody else had quoted this morning, so I went back and I reread the Declaration of Independence this morning, and there's these 4 bullets that just absolutely struck me.
Yeah.
For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. And it goes on and on and on, including for taking away our charters, abolishing our valuable laws, altering fundamentally the forms of our government, suspending our legislatures, declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever, plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. It goes on, but it struck me today, and I actually found it kind of optimistic. I found it kind of heartening because you could make these same bill of particulars against Donald Trump right now.
Yep.
He has decided he's a king. He's decided he's an authoritarian. And Americans have decided historically to say no to that. And I think we're getting closer to that by the day.
Well, and I'll tell you, the tariffs thing is a very important part of what happens next in this regard, because the negativity in the electorate around the tariffs is off the charts for good reasons, right? It's right, raising the prices on everything for everybody, basically, right? And what Tim Kaine, I had Tim Kaine on last week on Tehopium, who is leading the charge in the Senate. Yes. And the essential argument they're making is that Trump doesn't actually have any legal or constitutional authority to levy these tariffs, right? I mean, it's an imaginary authority that he has.
These are not ruling. These are not legally binding documents.
Right. I mean, so it forces the issue of the usurpations, the abuses, the injuries, and this, what I call a second front. Democrats have been living very comfortably in a place around the economy for the last few months where they have focused rightfully their energies. But we need to open up a second front against Trump that is about all of this, right? That is about the abandonment of the constitutional order, the betrayal of America, the least American leader in all of American history, the return of a mad king after 250 years, whatever the languages you want to use. And I think the tariffs issue is actually the vehicle in which this conversation has to now happen. Because it is, in addition to the tariffs being reckless, dangerous, destructive, and all the things that it is, stupid, idiotic, right, whimsical, all the things, they're also unconstitutional and illegal, and he has no authority to implement them. And so if Congress can't get off its ass to go reclaim, we saw the poll just a couple days ago, voters were asked, do you believe Congress should take back tariff authority from the president, right? Which is an interesting way of posing it, but which he never had, but let's just assume that it is. 56% of Americans said yes. Only 33%, 1 out of 3 Americans believe that Trump was exercising his tariff authority appropriately. That's real, guys, you've done this before in politics. That's really fucking low, right?
That's
you get below 40 on anything, and you're in a place of hurt with the American people. He's only got a third of the public behind him on even the exercise of the power of these tariffs. And so I do think he's incredibly vulnerable for us to now open up this second front, as I call it, around
100%.
the issue of his improperly interpreting his mandate, his authorities in Washington. And Democrats have to, I think, develop this. What I have called for in order to do this is what I call a letter to America, which is something that I believe every Democrat should sign, that should emulate and be inspired by the Declaration of Independence. It should have language expressing that as half of the Congress, that they believe the president is, or I don't call him the President Trump, the leader of our country, because he isn't really a president in the American tradition, should follow. We should lay out in clear terms, just like Harvard did, about why we believe what he's doing is an abandonment of the constitutional order, and make our case, to your point, Rick, about the sort of the individual injuries and abuses. And that has to be a letter signed by half of Congress to the American people. And that letter can become the basis of every rally we do, every event we do. It's the touchstone for our opposition movement. It's a missing piece of our opposition
I will
movement.
say this. You know what? I think you just triggered something, Simon, in my head, and I really love this. Back in 1994, Democrats laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed about the contract with America.
I remember.
They thought it was hilarious and stupid and corny and cheesy, and they laughed and laughed and laughed about it right up until Election Day. Then they weren't laughing anymore. I think this has the capability to be a framing device for the minds of Americans who do not want to think about this stuff every day, who didn't want to think about it until the tariffs took this economy into the ditch, who didn't want to think about it until Social Security was put on the chopping block, who didn't want to think about it because that normalcy bias is like, yeah, he's crazy, but he's not going to mess with me. Well, he is, folks. But I like the idea of this as a framing mechanism. Short, sweet, punchy, clear. I think it's a really good idea.
I just
Really good idea.
I do too. I think it's brilliant. There seems to be this inability and assumption that by MAGA world that if they were not in power, none of this would be done to them. That there
Yes.
would be no attempt to. You think federal funds are important to Harvard? What about Hillsdale? What about
Sure.
all these small, conservative Bible colleges? They don't have a lot of billionaire graduates. They don't have huge hedge funds. The little college I went to in Vermont, which is like 2,000 people, it has a unbelievable has a endowment that's sort of like Ireland budget. These colleges are much better suited to survive this. And they don't think that they can go after conservative law firms. They don't think that they can go after conservative teachers if they feel that they're not. It's just, now that may not be a bad assumption because probably Democrats wouldn't do it. And that's part of the challenge here, I think, is it's an unequal playing field, that you have one
Yeah.
side that is willing to do whatever it takes, regardless of the morality of it, the legality of it, whatever. And the other side that still is saying, no, this is not who we are. And it's, if you read a lot of history books, particularly about World War II, that's the central question that they wrestled with a lot in World War II. Not to become that which you
Right.
are fighting.
Right.
Well, look, we should wrap this up, but everybody ought to subscribe to Hopium Chronicles.
Simon's work
Simon's
is terrific as always, guys. Thank
Substack.
you for coming on, Simon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's only a few things I read every day. That's one. The other, I read Rick Wilson's Substack every day. You're not going to have discussions like this in traditional corporate media.
No.
It's really a time when we have to chart our own path. So subscribing to Lincoln Square, it broadens the community, broadens the base. It gives the only way that we have to give ourselves power to do this. And it's going to take all of us in this. So
Yeah.
listen to Rick Wilson's Enemies List, the Lincoln Project podcast,
Joe
we have
Trippi's show.
the
Yeah.
Joe Trippi show.
And folks, we're expanding the offerings at Lincoln Square literally every day.
Yep.
We're bringing new stuff online. It's growing quickly, and we appreciate all of you. My dogs are barking. I'm sorry to say. We appreciate all of you. And look, one of the reasons we did this was we identified a while ago what was Trump's superpower in 2024. It wasn't that he was a better candidate or a better person or had a better argument. It was that the media infrastructure on the right had gotten so much more powerful and was so able to shape the narrative and control what MAGA and Republican voters were seeing and hearing and thinking. And we don't want to control what anybody sees or hears or thinks. We want to give you the options and the information so you can form opinions in a robust, healthy republic and a passionate democracy. So we'd love it if you guys would subscribe. There's free offerings. There's paid offerings that support the growth of the network. And it has been growing quickly. One of the fastest growing things on Substack. We're really, really grateful. Like every day we get up and go, oh my gosh, this means something to people out there. And we're just honored to be in the fight with y'all.
There's a strategy session show tonight that's for subscribers. And if you're not familiar with Maya May, who has this great show on Lincoln Square called Punching Up, she's a force of nature.
I'm
If Maya
exhausted just
May,
watching her.
I mean, she just really is an extraordinary person. You really have to watch that. That's
Super.
on Wednesday. So thank you. Keep fighting. We'll be back shortly. All the best.
Thanks,
See you guys.
everybody.
See ya.